With the battles having grown too big to fight, Justin Trudeau has brandished the white flag.
Last night over dinner, I told my kids about the decision that I'm sharing with you today. I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
In-house tensions reached their peak 3 weeks ago when Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, Trudeau's most loyal cabinet member, handed in her resignation. The now outgoing Canadian Prime Minister says he's asked the party's president to begin the voting process, as the Liberal Party will seek to restructure ahead of the general election to come before the end of October.
I'm excited to see the process unfold in the months ahead. We were elected for the third time in 2021 to strengthen the economy post-pandemic and advance Canada's interests in a complicated world. And that is exactly the job that I and we will continue to do for Canadians.
Trudeau's popularity among voters has waned post-pandemic, with Canadians unsatisfied with his measures to battle the cost of living crisis. Voted in as the country's second youngest Prime Minister in 2015, Trudeau was at first celebrated for bringing Liberal values back to Canada following a decade of Conservative rule. But now, some studies have found that the Liberal Party is at its lowest rate of support in the country's modern history.
While leaderless Liberals focus on saving their jobs and fighting...
While the leader of the opposition is twice as popular as Trudeau in the polls.
An out-of-control housing emergency.
Parliament will be suspended until the 24th of March.
Justin Trudeau then announcing he is to resign. The Liberal Party in Canada is in search of a new leader, who of course will then become Canada's Prime Minister. Let's bring in for more analysis and more context, and perhaps a look into what the future might hold. Shachi Kurl, President of the Angus Reid Institute in Vancouver. Shachi, thanks for being with us here in France Studio 4. We appreciate your presence. Tell me, Justin Trudeau was elected with a great deal of enthusiasm and obviously was very popular at the start. Is it just inevitable that a popular leader will eventually see it all turns to vinegar, or did he do something in particular along the way to make this happen? Give us a sense of that.
Well, one cannot reflect. Thank you for having me. Bonsoir. One cannot reflect on his resignation today without thinking about those heady days. He referred to them himself as sunny ways, a time when the Liberals were riding very high in the polls, won a landslide in 2015, and his own personal approval numbers were in the high 60% levels, not just for 1 or 2 quarters, but for an extended period of time. And, you're absolutely right. In Canada, over the last 50 years or so, a government lasts about a decade, maybe 8 years, maybe 9 years, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter. But at some point, the milk turns sour. At some point, the best before consumption date passes. And in Mr. Trudeau's case, but also in the Liberal government's case, this is less about something in particular that he had done in terms of a very unpopular policy, and more about, number one, longevity and the fatigue factor, but 2, also what I would call the wicked problems that have plagued governments across Western liberal democracies, regardless of stripe. We saw a Conservative government in the UK tossed out after a long period of time because people were feeling stressed around cost of living. We've seen the same problems in France. We saw the same problem in the United States just last November. And we are poised to see a change in government in Canada, in part because people do not feel like they have economic financial security, that they cannot get ahead financially.
Was perhaps the re-election of Donald Trump the final straw for Justin Trudeau? Trump today saying that Canada should merge with the United States. That's one of Trump's possible solutions.
Yeah, he's been saying that a lot. I can tell you that even conservative-leaning Canadians don't put much interest in joining the United States. And if Canadians were voting in a presidential election in the United States, they would overwhelmingly vote against Donald Trump, even conservatives north of the border. So Donald Trump's presence and re-election had an impact, but in an indirect manner. Trump has threatened 25% tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States. And to really expose and explain what a significant problem this would be for Canada, Canada and the United States have very close and meshed, intertwined economies. This would be a 25% blanket tariff on Canadian exports, disastrous for the Canadian economy. In theory, Canadians put more faith in the opposition leader's ability to handle Trump, but he is untested. He's never been prime minister. And I think that just has to do, in general, with support for the opposition leader. But what ultimately was the straw that broke the camel's back was the fact that Justin Trudeau, in a political attempt to gain some favor with Canadians, proposed a sales tax holiday. We had it for 2 weeks, exempted federal sales tax on a number of items, and additionally wanted to send out sales tax rebate checks to millions of households. This prompted the former finance minister to say, look, this is not responsible. It's a political gimmick. It will cost government coffers too much money at a time when the Canadian economic situation is already fairly precarious if those tariffs come in. So I would say it's more indirect in terms of the Trump factor than direct, but it was very much about the tariffs that caused the finance minister to say, look, I'm done, I quit, which ultimately really put the nail in the coffin for Justin Trudeau, who had been on a long slide downwards in terms of vote intention. But I can tell you that in the days following the finance minister's resignation, we saw the Liberal Party's vote intent fortunes drop, as was mentioned in the report just prior. It was our data that showed the party at 16% in terms of vote intention. This is the natural governing party, which they call it in Canada. The Liberals have been, and this would have been one of the worst outcomes for the party. And it also reflected one of the worst outcomes personally for the Liberal leader.
Shachi, can I take you back in time a little bit to reflect about the name Trudeau? Because, of course, Justin Trudeau isn't the first of his family to be Prime Minister of Canada. When he was born, his father, his dad, Pierre, was the Prime Minister. I'm wondering how, and this is obviously a compare and contrast question, isn't it? How does he compare to his father? Both, of course, long-serving Prime Ministers. How will he rank, one or two? I don't know. You give us your sense of that.
It's, I think in general, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I find that politicians tend to do better in retrospective than they do in real time. So we've seen it time and time again. Even Winston Churchill lost an election in the post-war years. People were tired of him, and look at how much he is lionized today. Look at Richard Nixon, grudgingly respected or genuinely respected, although he too was drummed from office. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time to really understand Justin Trudeau's legacy, but he was a left-of-center progressive beacon of light for, again, not just Canada, but much of the Western liberal world at a time when many European democracies and the United States were tilting to the right. I feel like now we're in a situation where electorates around the world don't really care who is right or who is left. They're just in a mood for change. And I think that is very much reflected in the data that we're seeing right now. One thing I want to point out about the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, is that while his party is leading all opposition leaders and opposition parties by double digits, including the governing Liberals, what's important to note is that he personally is not particularly popular. His unfavorable numbers are actually higher than his favorable numbers. So when we talk about a move towards the Conservatives, it's less about people sort of swooning for a popular leader and more about a desire for change. And so we've got a change now with the Prime Minister's pledge to leave and to elect and for the Liberals to elect a new leader. And in some ways, I don't want to go too far in saying this, but in some ways it levels the playing field, but only a bit.
Shachi Kurl of the Angus Reid Institute, president of that body, joining us live from Vancouver. Thank you very much indeed for that analysis, giving us a far broader context into the announcement of Justin Trudeau's resignation as leader of the Liberals, therefore as Prime Minister of Canada, and it's all change at the top there. Thanks again to Shachi Kurl of the Angus Reid Institute. Thank you indeed. We're watching for developments.